What would you do if all you had left in the world were $2 and a memory? What if your only chance at a future meant buying something everyone else had already thrown away? For one young woman in the vast, unforgiving Dakota Territory, that choice would lead to a discovery that would rewrite her destiny and the history of a small, dusty town. But the truth waiting inside a collapsed sod house wasn't one of gold or silver. It was a story of hope, buried under years of dirt and deceit. Settle in, and let us know where you're watching from tonight. This is a story about the things we choose to see, and the inheritance we earn with our own two hands. Polly Voss arrived in the town of Providence with dust in her throat and an ache in her bones that had nothing to do with the jostling wagon ride. At 22, she was an orphan. The simple wooden cross marking her father's grave outside Bismarck was the last period on the final sentence of her family. All that remained of him, of them, was a heavy, scarred tool chest and the calluses on her own hands. Providence was a splinter of a town driven into the prairie and left to weather. Its single street was a river of dust, its buildings slumped like tired old men. From the moment she stepped down, she felt the town's gaze, indifferent, yet sharp, assessing her worth and finding it wanting. She had $3 and some change to her name, a threadbare dress, and a grief so profound it felt like a second, heavier skeleton inside her own. She took a room at the boarding house, the dollar she paid for it feeling like a betrayal of her own survival. That night, she lay on the lumpy mattress and listened to the sounds of the town die down, replaced by the vast, empty hum of the plains. She remembered her father, a carpenter whose hands were never still, saying, "They can take anything from you, Polly, your money, your crop, your time. But they can't take the land from under your feet if you own it square." It was his creed, the belief that had carried him west, and the belief that had left him with little more than a plot to be buried in. Yet the words echoed in her now, a final piece of fatherly advice. The next morning, over a meager breakfast she couldn't rightly afford, she heard two cattlemen talking. They laughed about a claim being sold off by the land office for back taxes. Claim 734. One of them snorted. More like the devil's ash pit. Not enough water on that whole quarter section to baptize a flea. The other man chuckled. Some poor fool will buy it though. Always does. Polly listened, her coffee growing cold. A fool's purchase. A place no one wanted. It sounded like a mirror of her own circumstances. It sounded like the only thing in the world she might be able to afford. An idea, desperate and defiant, began to form in her heart. She would not be a laundress or a seamstress, slowly fading in a rented room. She would own something, even if it was just a patch of dirt. She finished her breakfast, left the boarding house, and with her father's tool chest in one hand and her remaining $2 in the other, she walked toward the land office, her stride unsteady but her purpose as solid as stone. The land office smelled of stale paper, ink, and the faint, bitter scent of shattered dreams. The clerk, a man with a green visor that shadowed his eyes, didn't bother to look up when Polly entered. He was busy tidying a stack of papers, his movements practiced and bored. "Help you?" he asked, his voice flat. Polly placed her father's tool chest on the floor and stepped up to the counter. Her own voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "I'd like to purchase a claim," she said. He finally looked at her, his gaze taking in her worn dress and the exhaustion on her young face. A flicker of something, pity or maybe just mild interest, crossed his features before being extinguished. "Which one?" he asked. "Claim 734, she said, the number feeling strange and momentous on her tongue. The clerk's eyebrows lifted. He almost smiled. "That one? Taxes are $2. He said it not as a price, but as a warning. He was giving her a chance to reconsider her foolishness. Polly met his gaze and pushed her last $2 across the worn wooden counter. The sound they made was definitive, final, with a sigh that suggested he'd seen this particular brand of desperation 100 times before. He pulled a large ledger from a shelf, found the entry, and made a notation with a scratchy pen. He took out a deed, dipped the pen again, and wrote her name, Polly Voss, in a looping, indifferent script. He blew on the ink, then took a heavy stamp and slammed it down on the document. The thud echoed in the quiet room. He folded the paper and slid it toward her. "It's yours," he said, his tone making it clear he believed she had just purchased a quarter section of pure trouble. "No water rights, mind you. The soddy on it collapsed a few winters back. Belongs to you now, though, the ruin and the dust." Polly took the deed. The paper was crisp, official. It felt both as heavy as a gravestone and as light as a prayer. She folded it carefully and tucked it into a small pocket inside her dress, the paper resting against her skin. She had done it. She owned land. She was also completely, utterly broke. As she turned to leave, the clerk spoke again, his voice holding that same note of weary cynicism. "Good luck, Miss Voss. You'll need it." She didn't reply. She simply picked up her tool chest and walked out into the blinding Dakota sun. A landowner with nowhere to sleep and nothing to eat. Why would a young woman, orphaned and alone, spend her very last dollar on a piece of land everyone in their right mind had written off as worthless? Was it an act of faith, or one of pure, unadulterated desperation? And what secret, if any, could possibly be hiding beneath the collapsed earth of that forgotten home? Let us know what you think her chances are in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for the rest of Polly's incredible journey. Because as she stood there, clutching a deed to a patch of dust, the real story of Claim 734 was just beginning to stir. The sunlight was harsh after the gloom of the land office, and for a moment, Polly had to shield her eyes. When she lowered her hand, a man was standing in her path, blocking her way. He was tall and broad, dressed in a fine wool coat despite the heat. A stark contrast to her own faded calico. His face was florid, his eyes small and shrewd. This was Silas Croft, a man whose name she had already heard, whispered in tones of resentment and fear. He was a speculator, a man who bought and sold land not to work it, but to profit from it. He looked from the land office door to Polly, a slow, contemptuous smile spreading across his face. Well, he boomed, his voice loud enough for half the street to hear. "If it isn't the newest landowner in Providence. I hear you paid a whole $2 for the Dust Bowl." A few men loitering outside the saloon chuckled. Croft gestured vaguely to the west. "I wouldn't graze my sickest cow on that patch, girl. What in God's name do you plan to do with it? Weep on it and hope for a flood?" Polly felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck, but she held her ground. She looked at his polished boots, then back up to his mocking eyes, and said nothing. Her silence seemed to enrage him more than any retort could have. He saw her father's tool chest at her feet. "Ah, a carpenter, are we?" he sneered. "Planning to build a castle out of dirt clods and regret?" He laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "You'll be back in town in a week, begging for work as a laundress. Mark my words." He finally stepped aside, dismissing her with a wave of his hand as if shooing a fly. Polly picked up her chest and walked on, the sound of his laughter following her down the street. She refused to look back. She spent her last few coins on a small sack of flour, a slab of salt pork, and a handful of coffee beans, enough for a few days if she was careful. As she was leaving the general store, her arms full, she passed a small, neat cabin with a porch. An old woman sat in a rocking chair, her face a road map of wrinkles, her eyes dark and watchful. She had been there when Polly first arrived, a silent observer on the edge of the town's activity. As Polly drew level with the porch, the woman's rocking ceased. Her voice, when it came, was as dry and cracked as the prairie earth. But it carried a strange weight. "Some roots grow in the dark," the woman said, not looking at Polly directly, but out toward the horizon. Polly stopped, uncertain if she was being addressed. The woman continued, her gaze unwavering. You mind the water, child. Not the water you see, but the water you remember. Polly stood there, confused. The words made no sense. Water, you remember? Her claim had no water. That was its fatal flaw. She murmured a polite, "Thank you, ma'am," though she wasn't sure what she was thanking her for. The woman gave a slow, deliberate nod, and her chair began to rock again, a quiet, rhythmic creak in the afternoon heat. Shaking off the strange encounter, Polly adjusted her grip on her supplies and left the noise and judgment of Providence behind her. She set her face toward the west, toward her plot of land. The laughter of Silas Croft echoed in her memory, but it was the old woman's cryptic words that settled deeper, a peculiar and unsettling stone in the pit of her stomach. The walk was longer than she'd anticipated, the sun a relentless hammer against her back. The road dissolved into a faint wagon track, which in turn faded into the open prairie. The landscape was a monotonous sweep of brown and pale green, the grasses brittle and whispering in the hot wind. There were no trees, no landmarks, just the endless dome of the sky and the curve of the earth. Following the crude map the clerk had drawn for her, she finally saw it as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, a low, dark mound on the prairie, the only interruption in the flatness for miles. This was Claim 734. Her land. Her home. Her heart sank. It was worse than she had imagined. The soddy wasn't just collapsed, it was a ruin. A heap of earth and blackened, rotted timbers melting back into the prairie from which it came. It looked less like a former dwelling and more like an ancient burial mound, a monument to failure. Disappointment, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. Croft was right. The town was right. She was a fool. The sun bled across the sky in hues of orange and violet, the beauty of it feeling like a mockery. The air grew cool. The silence was absolute, a physical presence that pressed in on her. It was a silence unbroken by the lowing of cattle, the crow of a rooster, or the distant sound of a human voice. Out here, she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. She was too tired to even attempt to explore the ruin. Instead, she found a relatively flat patch of ground a few yards away, sheltered from the wind by the bulk of the collapsed soddy itself. She gathered dried buffalo chips and a few scraps of wood from the wreckage to build a small, cautious fire. The flames were a tiny pinprick of defiant life in the immense, gathering dark. She boiled water for coffee and fried a small piece of salt pork, the smell of it achingly domestic in the vast wilderness. She ate slowly, rationing her hope as much as her food. Afterwards, she unrolled her thin blanket, placing her father's tool chest beside her, its familiar, solid shape a small comfort. She lay down, pulling the blanket up to her chin, and stared at the sky. The stars began to appear, not the soft, familiar stars of her childhood, but a brilliant, cold spray of diamonds scattered across black velvet. They looked distant, indifferent. A lone coyote yelped, its call sharp and lonely, and another answered from miles away. The sound amplified her isolation, making her feel like the last person on earth. She clutched the handle of her father's axe, its worn wood a tangible link to a world that no longer existed, and eventually fell into a troubled sleep, the ruin of her new home standing guard over her uneasy dreams. The morning light was pale and unforgiving. It revealed the full extent of the soddy's decay. The thick prairie sod bricks that had formed the walls had slumped and eroded, and the heavy cottonwood beams that once supported the roof lay in a tangled, splintered heap, half buried in dirt and debris. It looked as though a giant had stepped on it. Polly's first thought was that it was unsalvageable. Her second was that she had no other choice. She needed shelter, and this pile of dirt and rot was the only thing she had. After a breakfast of hardtack and black coffee, she set to work. She grabbed the small shovel from her father's chest and began the back-breaking task of clearing the entrance. The work was slow and grueling. Dirt, tangled grass roots, and chunks of sod rained down as she dug. By midday, she had cleared a narrow opening into the dark interior. The air that wafted out was thick with the smell of damp earth, rot, and the faint scent of old ash. Inside, it was a chaotic jumble. More collapsed timbers, remnants of crude furniture crushed beneath the weight of the roof, and a thick layer of dirt covering everything. Her plan was simple and born of necessity. Clear the debris, salvage what timbers she could, and try to create a small, stable space within the ruin where she could be safe from the wind and rain. She started with the largest of the fallen roof beams near the center of the single room. It was heavy, waterlogged, and slick with decay. As she struggled to pry it loose, her gaze fell upon the floor beneath it. Most of the floor was just packed earth, but near what must have been the hearth, a row of heavy, hand-hewn timbers had been laid down as a sort of foundation. One of them caught her eye. It was set at a slight, almost imperceptible angle to the others. And while the rest of the wood was dark and damp, this particular timber seemed drier, its grain a lighter shade of brown. It was a small thing, a detail that didn't quite fit the haphazard construction of the rest of the dwelling. It looked deliberate. For a moment, she paused, her curiosity piqued. But the sun was high, and there was too much work to do. It was probably just a poorly set beam, another sign of the shoddy work that had led to this collapse. She pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to fatigue, and turned her attention back to the heavy, uncooperative roof beam. The anomalous timber could wait. The immediate, crushing reality of her task demanded all of her attention. But as she worked, her mind kept returning to that one piece of wood that refused to lie straight. Days bled into one another, measured not by a calendar but by the slow arc of the sun and the deepening ache in her muscles. Polly's life found a grueling rhythm. Wake at dawn, work until her body screamed for rest, eat a sparse meal by a small fire, and fall into an exhausted sleep. The town of Providence, with its mocking laughter and cynical stares, felt a world away. Out here, there was only the wind, the earth, and the work. She used the tools her father had left her, their familiar weight in her hands a source of quiet strength. The head of the axe, sharpened on a smooth stone, bit into the rotted wood. The shovel became an extension of her arms, moving earth hour after hour. The pry bar gave her leverage against the stubborn weight of the fallen roof. Her hands, once merely calloused, were now cracked and raw, but they were strong. She was slowly, painstakingly, clearing the ruin. She stacked the few salvageable timbers in a neat pile and carted the debris away in buckets, creating a growing mound of earth that looked like a fresh grave beside the old one. Through it all, the thought of the oddly placed floor timber nagged at her. It was a dissonant note in the simple, brutal song of her labor. Finally, one afternoon, when the sun was at its fiercest and she needed a respite from her heavy work, she decided to investigate. She took the pry bar and wedged its tip into the small gap between the strange beam and the one next to it. She put her weight on it. The beam resisted, then shifted with a soft groan. It wasn't nailed down. Encouraged, she worked the pry bar further underneath and heaved with all her might. With a final, sucking sound, the timber lifted free. Polly's heart hammered against her ribs. Beneath it was not more packed earth, but a small, rectangular hollow, no bigger than a bread box. The space had been carefully lined with oilcloth, now yellowed and cracked with age, to protect its contents from the damp. Her hands, trembling slightly from a mixture of effort and anticipation, reached into the cool darkness of the hollow. Her fingers brushed against something hard and cold. Metal. She pulled it out. It was a small tin box, the kind used for tobacco or tea, its surface pitted with rust. It was wedged shut, but after a few minutes of determined prying with the tip of a file, the lid popped open with a sigh of stale air. Inside, carefully folded and miraculously preserved, was a rectangle of canvas. Polly lifted it out. It was heavier than paper, more durable. As she unfolded it, her breath caught in her throat. It was a map, drawn by a steady, meticulous hand. It showed her claim, number 734, clearly marked. But it also showed more. Adjoining her parcel was another, labeled Agnes's Hope, with a small, elegant drawing of a water spring. And beyond that, a third, larger parcel, marked only with a simple cross, and the words, the buried third. The prairie wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, but she didn't notice. She stared at the map, at the elegant, hopeful script, and the world around her, the desolate ruin, the endless dust, began to transform. This wasn't a deed to a worthless patch of dirt. It was a key. The map was a puzzle. The boundaries were not marked with official survey lines, but with hand-drawn landmarks, the split rock, the tallest cottonwood, the ridge that looks like a sleeping man. These were the markers of someone who knew the land intimately, who read it like a book. But decades of wind and weather could have erased them all. Polly knew she couldn't decipher this alone. She needed someone who understood the language of surveying, the formal grammar that lay beneath this personal poetry. Her mind went immediately to the man she'd heard mentioned in town, John Hanley, the surveyor. He was known to be honest, a quiet man who kept to himself since his wife had passed. He was also, people said, wary of trouble. Presenting him with a mysterious map tied to the town's most worthless piece of land was surely an invitation for it. But she had no other choice. She walked back to Providence the next day, the map tucked safely inside her dress. This time, she didn't feel the town's judgmental stare. Her exhaustion was replaced by a thrumming, nervous energy. She found Hanley's office at the edge of town, a small, orderly cabin that doubled as his home. John Hanley was as they described, a man in his late 30s with sorrow in his eyes, but a firmness in his jaw. He listened to her story with polite skepticism, his expression guarded. He'd seen desperate people cling to impossible hopes before. But when she carefully unfolded the canvas map on his drafting table, his demeanor shifted. He leaned in, his professional curiosity overriding his caution. "This is Thorne's work," he murmured, tracing a line with his finger. Elias Thorne. He was the territorial surveyor here, 30 years ago. An eccentric old fellow, meticulous, honest to a fault. He began to study the annotations, his brow furrowed in concentration. Piece by piece, he unlocked the map's secrets. The second parcel, Agnes's Hope, was a water claim, filed under the name of Agnes Thorne, Elias's wife. It had been abandoned decades ago, likely after the spring Elias had discovered either dried up or was deliberately hidden. Agnes's Hope, Polly whispered, the name feeling sacred on her lips. It wasn't just a label. It was a prayer from a husband for his wife. She felt a sudden, fierce kinship with this woman she'd never met, another woman who had placed her hopes in this hard land. Hanley then turned his attention to the third parcel, the one marked with a cross. His expression grew grim. He cross-referenced the map with his own official charts. "Polly," he said, his voice low and serious, "this is a mineral claim. It's part of the old Red Creek grant. There was a scandal before statehood. A group of investors, including Silas Croft's father, used fraudulent paperwork to seize a huge tract of land from the original homesteaders. Thorne was the surveyor who exposed it. He was run out of the territory for his trouble." He looked from the map to Polly. "This map, this isn't just a map. It's Thorne's evidence. He must have hidden the true deed to this third parcel, and this is how he intended to find it again." The truth settled over Polly, vast and terrifying. Her $2 claim wasn't a random piece of forgotten land. It was the hiding place for a story of justice and fraud, a legacy of defiance left by an honest man. John Hanley's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp with warning. "If this is what I think it is, Polly, and if Croft gets wind of it, he will do anything to stop you from proving these claims are yours." Polly looked down at her calloused hands, then at the map. It was more than land now. It was a debt to the past. "It's my land," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I have to prove it." The first step was to find the spring. According to Thorne's map, it should be located in a shallow ravine on the adjoining parcel, hidden by what he had cryptically labeled a deliberate fall of stone. With John Hanley guiding them, they rode out from town, leaving the track and heading into the rolling prairie that Silas Croft used for open-range grazing. Hanley, carrying his transit and ranging rods, was all business, but Polly could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. They found the ravine easily enough, a gentle depression carved by ancient water, and at its head they found a large, jumbled pile of rocks and boulders, looking for all the world like a natural rockslide. But as Hanley examined it, he pointed. "See there?" he said, indicating a large, flat stone wedged at the base. "And there, the way those smaller rocks are chinked in? This wasn't a slide. This was built." Thorn blocked his own spring to hide it. They set to work with pry bars and raw strength, levering the smaller rocks out of the way. It was slow, arduous labor. As they paused to catch their breath, the sound of hoofbeats made them both freeze. 3 riders crested the nearby rise, silhouetted against the bright sky. At their lead was Silas Croft. His eyes, small and hard, took in the scene: Polly, John Hanley, the surveying equipment, and their work on the rock pile. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face as he rode down toward them, his men fanning out behind him. "Well now, Hanley, I didn't take you for a treasure hunter," he called out, his voice dripping with menace. "And Miss Voss, you seem to be trespassing. This is my grazing land." Polly's heart pounded. "We're on the parcel adjoining my claim," she stated, her voice steadier than she felt. "We're looking for a survey marker." Croft's eyes narrowed, fixing on the canvas map that Polly was clutching in her hand. "What's that you've got there? Some kind of pirate map?" he sneered, nudging his horse closer. "Give it here." John Hanley stepped calmly between Croft and Polly. "She has a legal right to survey the boundaries of her property. Croft, you know that." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the dry grass. Croft was bigger, and he had 2 men with him who looked like they were comfortable with violence. It was his word against theirs. He could take the map, destroy it, and no one would ever be the wiser. Polly felt a wave of terror, but beneath it was a bedrock of pure, cold anger. She thought of Elias and Agnes Thorne, of their stolen hope. She would not let this man erase them. Just as Croft opened his mouth to give an order, a dark patch appeared on the dusty ground near the rock they had just moved. A trickle of water, black with ancient mud, seeped from beneath the stones. Then another. A small, steady flow began to emerge, the sound of it a miracle in the silence. Croft's gaze snapped to the water, his mask of contempt momentarily dropping to reveal raw, naked greed. He knew exactly what a hidden spring was worth in this dry country. He shot Polly a look of pure hatred, then wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over," he spat, before riding off, his men following close behind. The threat hung in the air, but as Polly and John watched them go, the sound of the growing stream was a promise of life, a victory won. The discovery of the spring changed everything. John Hanley helped Polly file the paperwork at the land office to assume the abandoned water claim of Agnes Thorne. The clerk, the same man who had sold her the worthless deed, now looked at her with a dazed mixture of shock and respect. The news spread through Providence like a grass fire. The girl who'd bought the dust bowl had found water. The whispers that followed Polly were no longer mocking. They were filled with awe and envy. People who had ignored her now tipped their hats. But the spring was only the beginning. The real prize was the buried third, the mineral claim that Elias Thorne had tried to protect from Croft's family. Armed with the water rights, which gave them legal access to the adjoining land, Polly and John set out to find Thorne's final markers. The map led them to a gnarled, ancient cottonwood near a dry creek bed. There, half swallowed by bark, was the blaze mark Thorne had carved decades earlier. Miles from there, on a rocky outcrop, they found the last marker, an iron survey rod driven deep into a fissure in the stone, exactly where the map's cross was drawn. It was all there. The proof was irrefutable. John spent a week drafting a meticulous new survey and a legal affidavit, detailing the history of the claims, the discovery of the map, and the rediscovery of Thorne's original markers. He compiled old territorial records that documented the Red Creek land fraud and Elias Thorne's role in exposing it. It was a masterful piece of legal and historical detective work. They presented the entire case to the visiting federal land marshal, a stern, impartial man sent by the territorial government. Silas Croft, as expected, arrived with a lawyer from Bismarck, blustering about his family's long-held grazing rights and dismissing Polly's claim as a fantasy built on a fraudulent map. But his arguments crumbled under the weight of John Hanley's evidence. The map, the spring, the iron rod, they told a story that was too coherent, too powerful to deny. The marshal listened to both sides without expression, then delivered his judgment. The original Thorne deeds, having never been legally voided, took precedence. The land belonged to Polly Voss. Croft was not ruined or arrested. The original fraud was too old, the lines of culpability too blurred by time. But he was profoundly, publicly humbled. His power, built on bluster and intimidation, had been checked by a broke orphan girl with a $2 deed and an old map. The town's transformation was complete. They no longer saw her as a fool, but as a founder. The area began to be known not as the Dust Bowl, but as Voss Springs. One afternoon, a family of homesteaders, their wagon axle broken, limped to her property. Polly gave them water from her spring, shared her food, and offered the husband the use of her father's tools to make the repair. They stayed for 2 days, sheltered in the small but sturdy soddy she had rebuilt with her own hands. When they left, they spread the story of her quiet generosity to every person they met. The laughter of the town had turned to reverence. Months had passed. The fierce heat of summer had softened into the golden melancholy of autumn. The sun was low in the sky, casting long, warm shadows across the valley that was now hers. Polly stood on a small rise, looking out at what she had made. The soddy was no longer a ruin, but a home, small and solid, with a plume of wood smoke curling from its new stone chimney. Near the spring, which now pooled into a clear, tranquil pond fringed with cattails, a small vegetable garden had yielded a modest harvest. Her father's axe, its blade clean and sharp, leaned against the doorframe, its work done for the day. The land was no longer silent. It was filled with the gentle sounds of her own life. The lowing of the single milk cow she had bought, the rustle of wind in the tall grass, the murmur of the spring. She heard a horse approaching and turned to see John Hanley riding up the gentle slope. He was no longer just a surveyor, but a friend, a partner in this unlikely venture. He reined in his horse and looked around, his gaze taking in the house, the pond, the neat stacks of firewood. A slow, genuine smile touched his face. "You did it, Polly," he said, his voice filled with a quiet admiration. "You have a real home here." Polly looked out at the rolling land before her, the 3 parcels, once separate and lost, now joined together as one. The worthless dust patch, the hidden spring, the buried field. It was all hers, earned not by money or by birthright, but by labor and belief. "My father always said land is the only thing that lasts," she said, her voice soft in the evening air. She turned to look at John, the golden light catching in her hair. "He was wrong," she continued. "It's what you build on it that does." They stood together in the fading light, in a comfortable and easy silence, watching the last colors of the day paint the vast Dakota sky. She hadn't just found a home, she had built one, not just from sod and timber, but from the forgotten hopes of others and the strength she had discovered deep within herself. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet courage. It's a powerful reminder that true inheritance isn't what we're given, but what we have the heart to claim. If you were moved by Polly's journey, please leave a like and a comment below, and subscribe for more stories from the forgotten corners of history. We'll see you next time.